to participate in social media. What I'd like to now is introduce Stephen Collins. Stephen is someone who's a leading proponent of participatory culture. It's great to have someone from across the ditch to talk about what's happening in this space. I think in New Zealand we're such a small country that we don't have a great developed civic society to the same level of places like the UK, and it's good to see places like Australia developing something, and I'm looking forward to hearing us talk about public engagement and public empowerment.
I'll just take a couple seconds. This is going to be annoying. Sorry for a sec. Thank you. Yeah. No, that's probably a really bad idea. We're good. Rightio. I'm Steve Collins. I'm here from Australia. I'm an ex-public servant, but have been working in private enterprise for about the last 6 years. And I'm fairly heavily involved in the e-democracy movement in Australia. Happy to talk to anyone about what we're doing and what's going to come up in here in the next 30 to 40 odd minutes. So the Govis taglines: connect, share, learn. So my first question today is, where's the conference Wi-Fi network for all of us to connect? It's a must-have for every conference these days. Why are we recording the conference proceedings for later distribution? Why aren't we streaming them live over the net and recording them? Where are the tools for all of us to give direct input into the conference sessions as they happen? An integrated back channel. My question for all of you is, how many of you are connected and sharing right now so that your colleagues who aren't here can be learning from your experience? Oops. How many of you are learning from each other? How many of you know what your peers from other agencies think of what's happening at this conference? More specifically, do you know in real time? I ask because these are important issues in the context of open government. Participation on your part is a critical component of the bigger picture. I ask because it's completely doable using free, publicly available tools. In fact, the conference website points to some of these tools: Flickr, Delicious, Twitter, SlideShare. And that connecting, sharing and learning is happening there, only you don't know about it because you're not connected. So here are the rules I generally give my presentations under, and I fully expect you to follow them. Everything and anything is possible. Ask why and why not, and expect a real answer. There are no bad ideas, just different ones. And passive consumption is pointless. Do tweet, do blog, do comment, do challenge, and do ask as you get out of this what you put in. If you've got the tools here today to be participating in this keynote, get them out now and use them. Connect, share, learn. So where have we been? Direct engagement in politics has been the purview of an educated and powerful few until recent times. Indeed, the role of the politician and the executive that serves him or her has largely been to tell us, the sheep-like masses, what's good for us and to expect us to blithely follow along. We change our minds only in the face of corruption and excess and exercise our democratic rights to switch to a lesser evil only at times of election. But oh my, how the world has changed. The beast of the hyper-connected masses slouches ever closer to the Bethlehem of political engagement. And the beast wants to talk with you. Yes, you, the politician and the public servant, directly, or at least more directly, and to hear from you, preferably a lot sooner than the next election or major policy or program rollout. 2 years ago at the last Govis, my friend and colleague Tara Hunt gave a keynote entitled Government 2.0, Architecting for Collaboration. In that keynote, Tara spoke of a structure for open, engaged government that riffed off Tim O'Reilly's rules for Web 2.0. Not so tenuous a linkage as you might think. Tara's proposed architecture centred on a rich, collaborative ecosystem of linkages between a citizen and a service provider, a researcher and information, a citizen and a public servant, a citizen and his or her personal information, and a citizen and his or her experience with the government. 2 years on, where are we? In this country and in Australia, we seem to be tinkering around the edges at best. Yet, we've seen fundamental shifts in the governments in both our countries. Governments that came to power, at least in part, on the basis of offering a brighter future of consideration and understanding of the needs of the public. We could be so much further on. Hope. Possibly the biggest obvious shift towards public engagement with government occurred with the election of President Obama in late 2008. The jury remains out, of course, as to whether the changes brought about by the new US administration will prove to be a real groundswell in the opening of government and the engagement of the public. However, the future looks bright, at least at the moment. I want you to spend a couple of minutes now looking at a short video from the Obama administration about the formation of the Office of Public Engagement.
Ever since I became a community organizer on the south side of Chicago 20 years ago, I've believed strongly that citizens should have a say in the way government works and in the policies that have an impact on their communities. That's at the heart of our democracy, and it's at the heart of the way I want this administration to serve the American people. Here at the White House, there's an office that exists as a place where the voices of ordinary Americans can be heard. It's called the Office of the Public Liaison. But I believe this office can and should do more. I want to hear from you, your ideas, your experiences, your stories. That's why we're updating this office, giving it a new mission and changing the name accordingly to the Office of Public Engagement. The office's director, Tina Chin, along with her team, has done a wonderful job, and I know she looks forward to the work ahead. This office will seek to engage as many Americans as possible in the difficult work of changing this country through meetings and conversations with groups and individuals held in Washington and across the country. We'll hold town halls and other events in person and online through a new webpage at whitehouse.gov. I encourage you to visit it. This site will have the latest video of visits to the White House, blog posts from our team at the Office of Public Engagement, as well as information about how you can provide your input and get involved. This is, after all, your government. We're also releasing the Citizens Briefing Book, which contains ideas voted on by more than 100,000 Americans who took the time to visit the transition website and share their thoughts. In fact, many of the ideas you offered, from improving light rail transit to modernizing our energy grid to creating a new national service corps, have been embraced by my administration. So I look forward to hearing more from you. We face extraordinary challenges as a nation, challenges that will require all of us to do our part. And as we begin the difficult work that lies ahead, know that the Office of Public Engagement and this White House will always have a door open to you, the American people. Thanks.
So there's a vitally important quote in that video that goes to the heart of what I'm talking about. Our commitment to openness means more than simply informing the American people about how decisions are made. It means recognising that government does not have all the answers and that public officials need to draw on what citizens know. That announcement and the program that speaks of is something that at present I simply can't imagine in Australia. A close friend of mine who happens to work for the State Department at the US Embassy in Canberra told me a story a few weeks back. We were at breakfast with a group of people who meet every couple of weeks. What do we have in common? All of us do work that involves us using social media in one form or another. This was my friend's first time at the breakfast. On that day, he met people who work in state and federal government, who work for PR companies, and who work for non-profits like the RSPCA. And he told us something pretty amazing and, frankly, pretty cool. About 6 weeks before all the staff at the State Department, he was assuming worldwide, had received a directive to engage with the public, to, as Pat said, get out there on Twitter and Facebook and whatever, and have a conversation with people. They were actively encouraged and very nearly mandated to act as ambassadors and evangelists for their government, right down to the most junior staff. No more media units and PR spin doctors as the sole intermediaries, struggling to control a conversation they had, in reality, lost control of years before. Instead, the conversation has been radically disintermediated, with real people doing real jobs, each now a part of the public and engaging face of the US government. He was excited, he felt empowered, and it was the motivating force behind him coming to his first Canberra social media breakfast. In the UK too, things are afoot. Just last week, the public announcement came of the appointment of Andrew Stott as the Director of Digital Engagement. The role is as the most senior public communicator in the UK civil service, focused specifically on the digital channel. Of course, the media immediately labelled him as the Twitter Tsar. But the job is far more than that. In a role fraught with risk and opportunity, Andrew Stott has the chance to bring the British government and its engagement with its hyper-connected constituency rushing into the 21st century. There is much to be gained if he gets it right. Nothing remotely like those examples exists in my country. So where are we now? The people want to engage. They want to have a conversation with a legislature and executive that listen to what they have to say. It's not so important that they act on all our wishes. More, it's important that people are heard and can hear back from those in government in a more human way. Pronouncements of what is good for us and nanny stating no longer cut it. In his incredibly important work, The Experience of Middle Australia, internationally recognised sociologist Dr. Michael Pusey of University of New South Wales states, change has depleted the resources that once were provided by older, denser forms of association. In a hyper-connected world, our ability to re-adopt these denser forms of association, made sustainable by tools such as social networks, become reality. We become the true global village, as much to the neighbour, to the bloke next door, as some geographically remote, but by association close neighbour with whom we share an interest. Our families and governing structures no longer inhabit a nearby day or two's ride from our wattle and daub huts. Rather, we live in a 24/7 by 365 always-on world where our village truly is global. In a world where we can be and are increasingly on, we face the very real risk of political, social, and cultural hyper-isolation if we fail to participate as individuals and as a part of society. Already we see this happening in our own lives as we increasingly turn to trusted sources for information, turning our back in growing numbers on the formal media, which has yet to catch up with this engaged super community. We empower ourselves to make better, more informed decisions and to take action on those decisions. This gathering together to do as we need, when we need, with whom we need, learning as we go, is the core premise of NYU Professor Clay Shirky's Here Comes Everybody. It is also the foundation of many of the lectures of my friend Mark Pesce as he discusses the growing power of the connected community. In his talk, Hyperpolitics American Style, given at last year's Personal Democracy Forum in New York, Mark truly connected the dots for us when he said, hyperconnectivity begets hypermimesis, begets hyper-empowerment. Today, quite literally, the notion of power to the people is more true than ever. And it's true because government, by its very nature, is not built to operate in a connected 21st century. It is often too slow, too risk-averse, too monolithic. In many ways, the public has more or less invoked Gilmore's law on the executive, and in places is not far off doing the same to the legislature. We will route around the damage and do for ourselves what government seems incapable or unwilling to do for us. Sometimes it's just about getting a pothole filled, as Fix My Street does for you in the UK and Canada. Or perhaps it's about making sure you understand and can hold to account your local member for their level of contribution to their elected office. They work for you in the UK, and its local equivalents in Canada, Australia, and here in New Zealand are powerful tools to help keep a check on the activities of politicians, their parties, and the organisations with whom they are associated. But you have to wonder why these services of unarguable importance, needed to be built by the people at My Society. Why weren't they built by government? Why did they need to be built at all? If we had the open, engaged conversation we're talking about today with government, perhaps we wouldn't feel the need to watch the watchers. Of course, it's not just about keeping tabs on our politicians. More importantly, it's about giving the public more direct access to and input into policy making and legislative activity. In Australia, the right noises are beginning to be made. Less than a fortnight ago, Federal Finance Minister Lindsay Tanner had this to say: "I'm a great believer in these collaborative technologies opening up some tremendous possibilities for better government." Trouble is, this message doesn't seem to be making its way down to the doers, the public servants on the ground who want to engage in communities of practice and shared knowledge, or are keen to help out where they can with a client having a problem, whether or not it's their actual job. In fact, despite more than one official document declaring quite clearly that Australian public servants are not only entitled to engage online, but encouraged to do so should they wish, most government departments in Australia have tightly restricted networks with near draconian rules about what websites are permitted to be seen. And woe betide any public servant seen online in a social network. Demonstrably, it's slacking off. Here in New Zealand too, the government recognises the value of social media, and it's part in the conversation that the public sector and the governments it serves need to have with the public in order to provide the best advice to government and implement the best informed, most widely consulted programs and policies. I wonder, though, for this country and for my own, just how many of the doers are engaged in those conversations. How many of their managers and the leaders are accepting this groundswell? How many are embracing the cultural shift and encouraging their people to be out there connecting, live and in colour, with the public? Just imagine in this country if your political representatives and policymakers were really listening and engaged in the unarguably heated conversation over the Section 92A amendments to the Copyright Act. Perhaps the New Zealand Internet Blackout campaign would never have happened, and the embarrassing backdown that took place need never have occurred. In Australia too, we have an active online voice with respect to our government's proposed imposition of a mandatory clean feed, filtering out the nasties we no doubt need to be protected from as we think of the children. The government appears deaf to the intelligent and informed argument against all this ill-considered policy and the potentially hundreds of millions of dollars it could cost to implement if it comes to be. The clean feed is not only technically impractical, potentially slowing Australia's internet speed by a substantial factor, it is a policy that is largely simply not wanted by Australians. Further, the risky legal framework around the blacklist that will underpin the clean feed lacks transparency and possibility for review. These are just two examples. If government and the public sector were engaged in a conversation, in a more open way with the public, things might be different. Perhaps with the benefit of hindsight, there will be a little more listening to the informed public view when both the legislature and the executive are more engaged online in a fashion that meets the expectations of the growing online community. A community who expect to be heard, and a community who are desperately keen to engage with government and the public sector at every level. My own local senator, in a conjuring of the theories of the German philosopher and sociologist Jürgen Habermas, has instituted a series of events she is terming the public sphere. Open to all comers, the events are run in parallel, online and off, along a theme with the aim of gathering views, opinions and experience that would otherwise not get a hearing in the halls of power. The outcomes from these events will form briefing papers to be taken back to the party room in an effort to influence policy and the legislative agenda. This is a real effort to engage in the idea of Government 2.0, making government more accessible to the public, encouraging collaboration and idea sharing, looking for the best thinking and building trust in a group, politicians and public servants, who often struggle for trust from the public. The trust and social capital built on both sides acts to make access to government easier, transparency greater, and the canvassing of opinion much, much faster. What needs to happen, and happen soon, is a radical reimagining of the way in which governments engage and converse with the public. It's no longer necessary nor sufficient to make proclamations from on high. The constituency wants, and parts of it are demanding, an engaged, two-way and ongoing conversation with both politicians and the public sector. In places, this is already happening. In the UK, a significant number of local government bodies and an increasing number of national bodies are engaging one-on-one with the public. In the US too, government bodies are increasingly engaged with the public they serve. How else do you account for an oversubscribed event capped at 500 attendees that took place in Washington, DC just a few weeks ago? The Government 2.0 camp was a resounding success in attracting politicians, public sector workers, and a wide range of informed and engaged others to open up the conversation that must occur, taking input and participation from any interested party, and not just those who can afford lobbyists. And in Australia, we've got some momentum happening for this to happen in our country. In fact, we're probably doing it in August. Beyond conversation across the wall between the government and its constituency, there is another opportunity. It's an opportunity that many might be more willing to try. That opportunity is to do all this amongst yourselves, intra and inter-agency conversation and collaboration, a community of peers who can share and build on knowledge you might otherwise not have the chance to discuss. An effort along these lines has begun with GovDex in Australia, a whole-of-government wiki, but adoption remains low, with largely experimental communities and continued resistance from many agencies. Yet there are so many opportunities offered by a whole-of-government approach such as this. Supported by social networking tools within and between agencies, there are countless opportunities to engage in more open conversation, to measurably increase access to expertise, to promote innovative and forward-thinking problem-solving and policy formation. This isn't pie-in-the-sky stuff. There are measured and well-researched benefits to breaking down the silos within and between your organisations and rebooting work practices to a more open and collaborative model. We saw this the other day, so I'm going to skip through. This is Us Now.
More people can say.
By reorganising the way that's proposed in Us Now, culturally, technically, and in terms of the skills you give your people, you quite intentionally and directly build competency and expertise in the very business models and the tools the public expects you to be using to engage with them. Government 2.0 is as much about the way the public sector and the legislature organises itself as it is about the conversation and interaction with the public. By approaching this from a position of building expertise, you reap the rewards of increased productivity and the ability to deliver better services to the public. To quote Jason Ryan of the State Services Commission, in the hyper-connected world, engagement is predicated on understanding and utilising social media. With that understanding, that use and the needed expertise among your people, you place your organisations in the box seat to deliver on the promise of Government 2.0. You become that which Government 2.0 most aspires to be, An engaged and engaging public sector giving top quality advice to ministers thanks to an ongoing conversation with a public that involves receiving expert input and breadth of opinion from a diverse and informed base. I hardly think that's a bad thing. In Australia and New Zealand, we're now in a race to catch up, if only we can change the way government operates. The connected citizenry already know what's going on elsewhere and are keen to make their contribution. Open data. One of the most important factors in engaging and empowering the public in the business of government is open data. In Australia, the Australian Bureau of Statistics has licensed the vast majority of its data under a Creative Commons licence. This allows the ABS to distribute its data to anyone that can make use of it. The data is available for use by any individual or organisation that needs it, ready to match with any other data, but they are one of few. The newly appointed US Chief Information Officer Vivek Kundra had this to say on the matter of open data just weeks ago at the 2009 Government Web Managers Conference held in Washington. Government data prepared for public reuse should be offered in multiple formats, be machine readable, and adhere as closely as possible to lightweight standards. The opening of data collected by governments, combined with other publicly available data, has incredible potential to drive innovation and transform parts of the economy. And the engagement of government in a conversation with its constituency boosts greatly the power of that data freedom. There are already significant movements, such as the Data Portability Project, who aim to help define a data standard that would allow individuals like you and me control over and authorisation over the data gathered about us, as well as assist governments and private enterprise make informed decisions about in what form they should offer their publicly available data. An agreed to, truly portable data standard would allow information to be passed between bodies such as government, service providers such as the medical profession and education sector, and individuals, based on a set of authorisation and authentication rules attached to the standard. At the TED conference this year, I was lucky enough to hear Sir Tim Berners-Lee, the inventor of the World Wide Web. He had those of us in the crowd chanting a very important mantra: raw data now. What Sir Tim wants is for governments and businesses everywhere to release for us de-identified, unfiltered, unchanged data that they collect in our names and allow us to use it, to mash it up and to add value to it, and what value we could add. Projects like Google's effort to index public data around labour statistics and census findings has implications and presents possibilities that could spread globally. Other works like Nation Master and the recently released Wolfram Alpha present so many possibilities that the true implications for global policy making are difficult to grasp. In recent months, through the use of open data and an open communications model, in part at least forced on the agencies, we've seen amazing things happen with data on the Victorian bushfires, thanks to a joint effort between Google and the Victorian Premier's Office. It's just one example of data being used to increase public safety and inform the population, and here are a few more. With the recent H1N1 breakout, through the use of open communication models, leveraging social media, the US Centres for Disease Control and Prevention have been able to more actively engage in a conversation around the disease breakout and distribute accurate information in a far more immediate and timely way than the twice-daily stand-ups of the past. So too, the World Health Organization is using Twitter and other channels online to converse with and engage the public in an effort to clearly get their message out. Alongside official efforts, work by interested and engaged third parties empowered by the availability of open data is supporting the work of those in government. HealthMap is a graphical work mapping infectious disease reporting across the globe. Work of the importance of HealthMap, and have no doubt about how important it is, can only be empowered by public officials and their organisations who have overcome the fear of sharing and engagement that permeates much of government in the West. Efforts like this are increasingly common in the US and the UK, yet they're scarcer than hen's teeth in Australia. So, I ask you today, are your organisations sharing all of the data they could, and if not, why not? Of course, we have to have an appropriate level of governance to all this data interchange. We probably need government involved somewhere. However, in Australia, we've seen the government data interchange space best illustrated by the debacle that is NETA, the National E-Health Transitional Authority. infighting and a series of changes in management have seen Netta get effectively nowhere in more than 5 years, with a lack of openness, cost blowouts and disagreements, even in the face of an accepted de facto world standard for e-health records. Instead, programs such as Google Health are moving forward in leaps and bounds. Not that they won't have problems, but with a will and a deliberate intent to avoid pointless bureaucracy, they are well ahead of government activities which to date have to be marked not good enough. You say you want a revolution. This is where we come in. As members of the public and as public servants and politicians, we must engage. In our remote corner of the world, New Zealand and Australia, we need to engage as citizens and as public servants with the public we serve far more than we ever have before. We need to embrace a more open model of government that values an ongoing conversation with the public around policy, culture, security, trust, transparency, and the sharing of information and data. The largest part of e-government and e-politics still sees the world as online as just another place to make proclamations and tell people what is good for them, and at which country women's association meeting a politician is turning up to next. We, together, must be the catalyst to change that. When politicians and public servants truly seek to engage in an ongoing personal conversation with the public they serve, I believe we will have the opportunity to see a massive increase in public understanding of government. Alongside that, I believe we will see an attendant increase in an ability to get things done, with the public sector and the legislature working hand in hand with an informed, engaged and empowered community. In a hyper-connected world, we can be more informed than ever before, by more sources and from a broader opinion base than ever previously possible. We can be engaged in our communities, local, national or global. We can empower ourselves and others to know and understand. And we can act on information available to us in an informed, engaged way. This is a revolution whose time has come. And to somewhat misquote President Obama, not only yes we can, but yes we must. Imagine your public sector, your engagement, your government, if this was just what you did. Connect, share, learn. Thanks very much.
Questions? Just raise your hand if I can ask a question. One little bit, Ross. Is there a microphone somewhere? Hi, Carol. If you have questions, just call out what it is, Ross.
Good morning, Stephen.
Hi, Ross.
I was wondering, what would you say in response to the UK and the US governments having severely let down their constituencies with their behaviour over the last 8 years or so, and the role that e-democracy and the work that they're doing now to try and recapture the constituency versus the Australia and New Zealand, not really getting behind it because we haven't actually got the same situation?
I'm assuming you're talking about the rorts of the public purse that's happening in the UK.
I'm also talking about being talked into a war that hasn't really
Well, and those things too.
Can you just repeat the question?
Yeah, so, yeah, true. So I think Ros's question has a whole bunch of bits to it. But essentially, Roger asking about potentially the Australian and New Zealand perspective as opposed to the US and UK perspective with respect to, I guess, the pig-headed and bullish way the governments in those two nations have approached engaging in certain activities, whether that's rorting the public purse, engaging in wars. I think the shift towards public engagement that we're seeing in those two countries is, at least in part, a reaction to the public opinion that's being expressed in those countries with respect to those issues. In Australia, certainly, in terms of rorting the public purse, we have much tighter rules around political expenditure of money. But in terms of engaging in wars that arguably have no basis in fact for the reasons for them to be undertaken in the first place, I think that if the politicians were listening more closely to the public, engaged in a conversation, and not responding just to lobbyists, perhaps we would have made more well-informed decisions. And I think that's what this is about. This is about really engaging and making evidence-based policy.
I'm just commenting on asking for your comment on the fact that we don't have as much of a burning factor here.
There's no reason why we can't. We just have to do it.
Stephen, I wonder if you have any advice or any comments that you can give us about to pass on to CIOs with regards to getting rid of the firewalls, because that seems to be the major stumbling block. Well, it has been for me when I've wanted to set up a sort of 2.0 environment to get information from.
Absolutely, yeah, absolutely. Look, this
stakeholders.
is a conversation. I'm assuming that's been recorded because it's on a microphone. This is a conversation I've had with more than one person that who I've done work for or that I've worked with. The firewalls that we see in public sector agencies, which tend to be extremely restrictive, and I assume it's not terribly different here than it is to Australia. They need to be broken down. There's one agency that I'm aware of in Australia. It's a small agency, so they have some economies of scale at the small end that makes things a little bit easier to manage. But this is an agency that has deliberately said, no blockages, no rules about engaging, just go and do it, because what it does is it actually makes your job easier to do. And they have not had a data leakage in the 4 years that this policy's been in place. They've had no data leakages, they've had no improper use of technology, they've had no one say anything that they ought not to have said, because what they have done is implemented a framework around the openness that they've engaged in a way that says, if you're going to have a conversation, talk only about the things that you know how to talk about. When you don't know, when someone asks you a question that points to something that you don't know how to talk about, then hand the conversation to the person who does. And look, in this agency, it's not everyone that's engaging. It's only those who want to or that need to for their jobs. And I'm not advocating by any stretch of the measure that in, say, a 5,000 person agency, all 5,000 people engage, but only those who are comfortable in doing so, and potentially only those that the agency, after someone says, hey, I'd like to do this, puts them through a little bit of a ringer and says, right, well, here's how we expect you to communicate and here's what we expect you to say. Here's an example. I'm working with an agency. I won't name the agency because it would be inappropriate. I'm working with an agency at the moment on an application that involves combining GIS data with public health and population statistical data. And in that agency, in the area that I'm working, every second desk has one of these on it with a 3G dongle attached to it, because the people in that agency doing their work can't do it properly through their desktop machines. And so they're bringing their own laptops in and attaching 3G dongles to them so they can do their work properly. If the management making the decisions about blocking at the firewall were actually thinking about the reasons for doing that and actually making considered decisions about the risks, I think that would happen a lot less. That was a long, rambly answer to your question, but that's my opinion.
Other questions? Raise your hand, please.
So there's one up here. This gentleman has his hand up for a while.
Hi, Steve. I was reading last week a global e-government report from InsidePolitics.org. I don't know if you're familiar with them. But what was interesting to me was that New Zealand was ranked 19th in the world in 2007, I think it was 19th, and 31st in 2008. So I just wanted to get your feelings on where New Zealand sits in terms of this whole government 2.0 stuff. How do we compare? Are we falling behind the rest of the world, as this report seems to indicate? Any
think
thoughts?
From us looking towards you guys from Australia, you actually look to be ahead of where we are. But it's disappointing that you, and probably us, I'm assuming, have slipped. I think we have, particularly in Australia where we have mandatory voting, we don't have a choice about whether to turn up and vote. We can spoil our paper, but we must vote. I think in a country where you have an engaged populace, it's important to be open with them, to have a conversation with them. And if we're winding back those policies, and if we're winding back the access of the public to government, I think we're going backwards, and there's no question.
You talked about e-democracy as a way for discussion between citizens and government, I guess absent of lobbying and so on, and perhaps towards a bit more of a balanced and I guess true voice. But to me it feels as though it's still just as susceptible to having lobbying campaigns kind of overrun conversations. And I guess what sorts of techniques have you seen that allows I guess a minimisation of that so that it's a more fair, balanced discussion?
Yep. This is a question that I get asked in that form or another relatively frequently. What you find holds true in online communities and frankly in offline communities of interest is that the noisemakers and the show-offs, and by that you're talking about the self-interested groups, the lobbyists effectively, tend to get filtered out of the community. What happens particularly in online communities is the one subject noisy types who try to hijack the conversation relatively rapidly get removed from the conversation. And that's what happens when we see this direct engagement stuff. If I look at the Kate Lundy example, I have direct email and direct access through Twitter to people like Kate Lundy as well as a number of other federal politicians. And they are having a conversation with me. The opposition leader in Australia will have a conversation with me on Twitter. Senator Lundy will. Senator Lundy's staff will. The staff of the Greens will. And by doing that, there's a massive level of disintermediation that happens. Now, of course, if you've got a lobby group talking to those people, well, that conversation's happening as well. But because they're getting a breadth of opinion, what they can do is they can make much more well-informed decisions about which bits of that conversation to inform their policy making and their legislative agenda. But quite seriously, the noisemakers get filtered out.
Stephen.
Yeah, it's on.
Sorry. Stephen, thank you. Basically, just power corrupts, absolute power corrupts.
Absolutely, of course it does.
Absolutely.
Yes.
Is listening and being heard enough, and is there a willingness to share power?
I think there's a significantly growing willingness, and those in power, and I'm talking about the executive and the legislature, those who have a position where they can influence policy making and legislation. I think we're finding in the communities where this is happening and happening effectively. Again, what happens is there's a removal, there's a disintermediation between those who seem to be misusing power. So you've seen the massive levels of mea culpa happening in the UK in the last week or so over the rorting of the public purse for cleaning the frogs out of your moat. That's happening with increasing frequency, and if you look at, say, Moldova earlier this year, there was massive public unrest that was organised and managed through interest groups on social networks, and the same thing has happened in Egypt on more than one occasion. So what happens is those in power who are misusing power, ultimately, even in countries like Moldova and Egypt, which are far from the democracies that you and I live in, are actually getting removed by the fact of public action, underpinned by those making the action being able to coordinate and organise in a rapid and coordinated way. Now, I don't think that this is all about removing those corrupt in power, because that will happen at elections anyway. It's about the conversation. I think the conversation is the more important thing. But yeah, your point is valid.
Stephen, in New Zealand and in other countries, we're seeing shrinking of government budgets. What impact do you see this having on opening data and increasing community engagement?
I actually think it's an opportunity rather than a problem. And here's why. Doing this stuff can be done if you do your thinking first and don't jump in and do stupid things. If you do your thinking first, if you do your planning well, you can implement a lot of these programs at near zero cost, except for the time of your staff. And because of that, the barrier to engagement goes away. It doesn't cost you anything but the time of your people to engage, and it doesn't cost the people who want to engage with you anything apart from their time. So actually, I think, while the loss of budgets, both in this country and in mine, is a problem, and hey, we would all be able to do a lot more things if we had more money. We can do this sort of stuff really, really cheaply. For example, Open Australia, which is based on the They Work For You model, it's the Australian version. The guys who set up Open Australia effectively picked up the phone, rang the guys at My Society in the UK and said, can we have a copy of your software? Sent it, and they're spending, there's a total of about 8 hours a week consumed keeping They Work For You updated. So yeah, this stuff is easy. Kate Lundy's stuff on the public sphere cost them nothing but 3 days of Pia Waugh, who's her ICT advisor's time. Didn't cost them any money because they used free software.
There's been a wave of reform of Australian freedom of information laws in Queensland, Tasmania, I think New South Wales, and of course at the federal level with Senator Faulkner. To what extent are Australian e-democracy activists like you engaged in trying to lobby for what we might call smarter freedom of information laws that reflect e-democracy?
We're actually quite heavily engaged, and we're heavily engaged effectively with our local members because it's a little bit harder to reach Senator Faulkner than it is to reach Senator Lundy. But quite seriously, the people that are doing this and doing this well, we've got... I was at a lunch recently, a completely informal lunch, just organised, for the hell of it on the day. And we had 3 senators and 2 senators' staff turn up because they wanted to hear what we were talking about. They're interested in knowing. And we were talking about the clean feed, and we were talking about Section 92A and here, and copyright reform as needed in Australia, and we were talking about the hope that we had for sensible FOI legislation. So yeah, people are interested, and perhaps surprisingly, they are listening. And listening directly, they turn up to lunch.
Okay, thank you, Stephen.
Thanks, Mike.
Okay, thank you, Stephen. I think you've certainly stirred people up in their thinking, and there's a lot of people there who want to talk to you over morning tea. So we'll take a break now for morning tea, sponsored by Sun Microsystems. Thank you.